This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Connecticut is home to many historic sites, including ones just off the coast. Coming up Where We Live, Emeritus State Archeologist Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni takes us on a journey, sharing his knowledge about the maritime sites, including shipwrecks along Connecticut's shoreline. We hear what happened to some of these ships and how they're being preserved. What questions did you have about shipwrecks off our coast? That conversation later. First, the largest hospital network in the state, Hartford Healthcare, has reached an agreement with the state labor department for its improper practice related to meal credit deductions for home health aides. The agreement returns nearly $479,000 in wages to 114 caregivers employed or once employed at Independence at Home, part of Hartford Healthcare. For more on this story, joining us is the reporter who uncovered the story, Jacqui Rabe Thomas, who reported this for Connecticut Public. Jacqui, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
So I understand when you worked on your story, you started it by talking about 2019 when Hartford Healthcare made a commitment to pay their workers at least the minimum wage. Tell us about that and then how you uncovered what was going on with these meal credit deductions.
Sure. So back in 2019, Hartford Healthcare made a big splash that they were going to raise their minimum wage of what they pay their workers to $15 an hour. And it was widely covered in the news, broadcast, television covered it, newspapers covered it, radio covered it. And it got a lot of fanfare as well from local politicians and state politicians who were gearing up to push for the state's minimum wage to increase to $15 an hour. And so, there was this conversation about the minimum wage, and you see Hartford Healthcare being this good actor in making this promise. And then, fast forward several years, and you have some home health aides who were coming forward and saying, hey, that's not necessarily the case. But some of these home health aides are here on work visas and were afraid to really speak up and go public about this. And so eventually a couple of them did decide to share their story with me. And what they shared was, look, we're not making $15 an hour. And this is a year and a half after these promises were made to us. And oh, by the way, we're also getting $17.50 taken out of our paycheck for meals that we were never offered, we were never provided. And then when we asked for them to stop, they wouldn't stop.
So tell us more about these home health aides. What was their particular job? And when you mentioned the $17.50, how long this added up?
Sure. So home health aides are a growing profession throughout the nation as more people want to live at home. There's a real push for people to keep people in their homes longer. It's not only more expensive, but it's more humane to keep people where they want to live rather than, hospitalization or nursing homes, allowing people to stay in their homes for longer. And in order to do that, you need some assistance sometimes. And so that's where home health aides come in. These are typically low-wage workers. They're also disproportionately Black and Hispanic. They're also disproportionately immigrants. National and state data show that. And you also have this push to move towards this, but there's not necessarily a push to raise the wages. The state of Connecticut did raise the minimum wage eventually, and it will eventually get to $15 an hour, I think by next October, if I remember correctly. But these home health aides are really sort of allowing people to stay in their homes longer. So Wayne, the gentleman that I featured in the story, he lived in the home of someone who had multiple strokes and was really struggling mentally to deal with that reality of not being able to go on long bicycle rides or travel the world. And so Wayne gave up, his family for months at a time to go live in the homes with people. And in return, he was paid $11.60 an hour.
And when we get back to the meal credit deduction, because these home health aides are spending so much time in these residences taking care of particular patients, are they supposed to be provided meals on their shifts? I'm just wondering, how did Hartford Healthcare begin taking this $17.50 out of paychecks to begin with?
So there is a process that allows for employers to deduct from someone's paycheck, but there's a framework that has to be followed in order to do that. You need to have the Department of Labor sign off on the amount that's being taken out, and it can't just be a number taken out of thin air. It has to be based on actual. Here's how much here's how much it actually costs to provide 3 meals a day. But those calculations were never done. And then, but then they were still charged and no meals were provided. And then on the other side, for the clients, those who are needing these services of people like Wayne and other folks who are living in their homes or coming to their homes every day and caring for them, they were still being charged. Or they were being told, if you don't provide the meals to your home health aides, you will be charged a hefty fine. And so the onus was really put on the client to, while this person's in your home, you need to feed them. And so there was a process that was allowed to be followed to charge people, but it was not followed here at all.
You also talked to someone who Wayne worked for, the spouse that had the multiple strokes, and this person went to the Department of Labor and inquired about this, and that's what got the investigation rolling?
Yeah, so Suzanne Hopgood, Wayne was living with her, and she had a few other folks before Wayne at a different organization, and she found out that Wayne wasn't making this. And Wayne, all along, he never told her that this thing was happening to him, that $17.50 was being taken out of his paycheck, or that he wasn't making $15 an hour. He wanted to be there for Frank, was the name of her husband. He wanted to be there for Frank when Frank was really struggling. Frank eventually passed away. And he thought that was more important than what he thought was a trivial issue of some money being taken out of his paycheck. You had someone who was in the last days of his life, that he wanted to be there for them instead of burden them with this terrible thing that was also happening to him. And so Suzanne and Wayne stayed in touch, and several months later they were talking because Suzanne was thinking about donating money to help workers like Wayne and her previous caregivers. And she said, what could have helped you? And what Wayne said was, well, it could have helped is that if the $17.50 wasn't being taken out of my paycheck. And she was just flummoxed because she was like, what? I don't understand how this is possible. It sounds like that's not allowed. But then Hartford Healthcare informed her that it is allowed, that they are following the law. They weren't going to. They were going to change the practice to stop charging it, but they didn't have plans to reimburse for all the money that had been taken away. And so the pay stubs that I have seen from workers shows that this adds up to thousands of dollars a year. So Wayne had well over $2,000 taken out of his paycheck the year that I saw, and then previous years, even larger amounts. And so when you look at just how much money we're talking about here, $17.50 each day might not sound a lot, but it really adds up very quickly.
Especially when people are paid minimum or below minimum wage. Jacqui, you're hearing reporter Jacqui Rabe Thomas here on the show as we learn about this practice that through Hartford Healthcare, their Independence at Home, part of their healthcare system that provides home health aides. They had been taking out meal credit deductions out of the workers' paychecks. People complained, as we heard in Jacqui's story as well, and the Department of Labor got involved. And so what was the agreement or settlement, Jacqui?
So the settlement, after the Department of Labor said, hey, I don't think this is all on board. We're going to open an investigation into this. And they found that these meals were improperly being charged of workers. And so the settlement that they reached with Hartford Healthcare was to look back 2 years. So they looked back 22 months actually. The Department of Labor only has the ability to look back 2 years from the date the complaint is made. And so they went back as far as they could on that. They also wanted to make sure that these workers got reimbursed as quickly as possible. And so they also agreed to waive the interest payments that state law allows the Department of Labor to levy on the money that was withheld. So the state law allows for 1% interest for each month that the money is withheld. And so, money from 3 years ago, that easily adds up to 36% interest. And so they waived that, and then they cut in half the fine that was levied on the Hartford Healthcare. And that was all done because to avoid a long, protracted legal argument and have it having to go to court to potentially be litigated.
We also heard from Hartford Healthcare in a statement this morning. In part, it reads, we recognize, however, that Independence at Home was not ensuring proper record keeping regarding the meals the caregiver received each day. We worked with the Department of Labor to examine and resolve this issue, and we have reimbursed caregivers for meal credits for the 2-year time frame requested by the Department of Labor. Also, we will take the additional step to reimburse live-in caregivers for the meal credits dating back to January 2016, when the meal credit practice began. Jacqui, what's your response to the statement we received?
I think that's going to cost them a lot of money, but I think it's the money that was taken out of paychecks that the law never allowed for it to be taken out to begin with. I am curious if they're going to pay $15 an hour to those workers as well.
Earlier, you mentioned how the reliance on home health aides has skyrocketed nationwide. And I'm wondering, when we think about, how workers are treated in terms of pay, in terms of benefits, vacations time, this is something that continues to need to be looked at. And I'm wondering, what's next in terms of looking at this particular story?
So there is a part 2 to this story that Connecticut Public will be airing. Reporter Brenda Leon is working on it diligently, and it should be publishing soon, that looks at the role that domestic workers and home health aides, nannies, etc., and the protections that they do and don't have. I'll tease it as there are huge loopholes that still exist. Connecticut has been working to close some of those loopholes, things like providing the protections for these workers to file harassment and discrimination complaints. Nationally, that's not the case, but in Connecticut, they have given domestic workers a Bill of Rights to allow them to do that here.
You've been hearing Jacqui Rabe Thomas, who reported this story for Connecticut Public. This note, she's starting a new job with Hearst, Connecticut. All the best to you, Jacqui, but I know I look forward to having you on the show again to talk about your continued investigative reporting in the state.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
Again, that's Jacqui Rabe Thomas. We'll make sure we link to that story on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Now, after the break, one of my favorite movies as a kid was The Goonies. A long lost ship, a prominent feature of that movie, a journey to find lost treasure. But did you ever think about the maritime sites off the coast of Connecticut? Emeritus State Archeologist Dr. Nick Bellantoni takes us on a journey, including some notable shipwrecks right off our coast. We'll learn more after a short break. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.
Hey, Mike found a map. Yeah. Hey, look. That says 1632. Is that a year or something?
No, it's your top score on pole position.
Yes, it's a year, Chuck. Look, it's a map of our coastline.
What's all that Spanish junk right there?
Who knows? Mouth, you said you could translate. Translate, right here. Yeah, translate it.
Ye intruders beware. Crushing death and grief. Soaked with blood of the trespassing thief.
You guys, this map is old news. Everybody and their grandfather went looking for that when our parents were our age. I mean, haven't you ever heard of that guy? What's his name? The pirate guy, One-Eyed Willie.
One-Eyed Willie.
That clip is from The Goonies, an 80s movie about a group of kids searching for a lost ship and its treasure. Did you ever think about the notable maritime sites and shipwrecks off Connecticut's shoreline? Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni is the guy to ask. He's Emeritus State Archeologist with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History. He teaches at UConn, and he joins us now by Zoom. Nick, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good morning, Lucy. Thanks for having me back.
Now, I imagine some of the shipwrecks that you know about are not the result of old, dusty maps found in attics. You're going to be talking more about Connecticut shipwrecks at the Mattituck Museum later this week. There's information on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. But tell us about some notable maritime sites and how you got interested in all this.
Well, basically, my background is not underwater archaeology. I'm kind of the guy that dealt with mostly skeletal remains in my career. But as the state archaeologist, I was responsible for the preservation of archaeological sites, terrestrial on our ground, if you will, within our soils, but also underwater. So that got us involved with recreation divers. It also got us involved with the State Historic Preservation Office, and also the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's Long Island Sound Program, and even at the federal level, the National Park Service, as well as NOAA, in terms of understanding better what kind of cultural resources we had under our waters. And that, of course, includes shipwrecks. So much of our study was not through old maps, but basically doing surveys underwater, side scan sonars, and other techniques to help us understand what might be there, and certainly to preserve them for the public into the future.
And we think about the history of Connecticut long before we were here. We know Native American sites, dugout canoes that have been found in some of the lakes in Connecticut. So tell us more about maritime archaeology and some of these sites that are notable, Nick.
Sure. In maritime archaeology, we include not just simply what's in Long Island Sound, say along our coast, but in our lakes, just as you described. Native Americans, for literally thousands of years, made dugout canoes. They would take trees, fell them, burn them in terms of hollowing out the interior of the canoe. And some of these were deliberately sunk in some cases beneath our lakes, our natural lakes, and as to be gotten back later. And they have been discovered under our waters. And when I say canoes of Native American origin, we think of the birch bark canoes, but that's mostly a northern New England phenomena. Here in Connecticut and Rhode Island, they mostly made dugouts, actually hollowing out trees. And some of these were formidable. Roger Williams, who befriended the Narragansetts and founded Providence, he writes in his journals that the Narragansetts had canoes that could fit 40 people. And these were kind of, I suppose you want to say, ocean-going vessels. We know from archaeological sites on Long Island, Block Island, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, that Native Americans maritimely were crisscrossing to these islands where they had family and would utilize the natural resources that were out there. So, when we think of shipwrecks during the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and even 20th centuries, we don't want to forget that Native Americans were quite comfortable out there in the waters and contributed to, our maritime history.
So when you find a particular site, and let's start with a Native American site and one of the lakes in Connecticut, how do you work with local town officials and others to preserve these sites, Nick?
Yeah, well, we work not only with local town officials and state officials in terms of these kind of sites, but also if we're dealing with Native American sites, we work with the Connecticut tribes. And we work very closely with them to not only help us identify and interpret what we have, but it's very important that we preserve these. These are, when it comes to underwater resources, just as terrestrial cultural resources, they're always endangered and need to be preserved. So working within, local, state, and federal governmental hierarchies and tribal governments, it really gives us our best chance to preserve these. And we preserve them for the public. We preserve them for researchers, but also so that the public can learn and understand more about Connecticut's role going back thousands of years in our coastal waters.
You're hearing Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni here on Where We Live, Emeritus State Archeologist, as we learn about the maritime sites and some shipwrecks off Connecticut's shore, also some sites found in lakes around our state. If you have a question, you can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I mentioned shipwrecks, and I'm thinking about the Connecticut River, some notable sites, including Aunt Polly. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, the Aunt Polly was William Gillette, the actor's yacht, if you will, at the turn of the 20th century. It was a beautiful vessel. He had a library on board, and he actually lived on the yacht when he was building Gillette's Castle, that is available to the public today as a state park. And when he finally finished the castle and moved up into it, about a week or two later, the yacht mysteriously burns at its moor on the Connecticut River. And that yacht, while it is no longer serviceable, is still there by the moor. And visitors to Gillette's Castle can actually see the vessel at low tide. It becomes somewhat exposed, covered during high tide. But it was quite a one of those vessels, if you will, from that turn of the Gilded Age, that turn of the 20th century, were very prominent and wealthy people had their own private yachts, and they still do today, obviously. But kind of a Gilded Age artifact, and we worked with the folks at Gillette's Castle as well as archaeologists from the University of Connecticut to go down and document that vessel. And it's really quite neat in terms of Connecticut history.
Coincidentally, Peter Martika, who's a journalist in Connecticut, had tweeted over the weekend a picture from, I believe, a state resident of the remains of this houseboat, Aunt Polly. I just retweeted it at Lucy VN. Really fascinating to see that, as you mentioned, Nick, when the water's low enough to see the remains of this houseboat.
Yeah, it's one of those underwater archaeological sites you don't have to dive to get down to. You could actually see it during low tide. And anybody interested, I would, on your next visit to Gillette's Castle, go in and talk to the rangers and so forth, and they will help you to get a glimpse of. In fact, if I understand correctly, they're in the process of doing a new exhibit on the Aunt Polly. So, contact the rangers at the state park, and they will assist you in seeing it.
So we've talked about some lakes in Connecticut, the Connecticut River, but how about off Long Island Sound? There's a Cornfield Point vessel. What happened, Nick?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting shipwreck in Long Island. First of all, just to note, Long Island Sound was an extremely important body of water throughout colonial history and the early history of our republic, not only for transportation, but military, movement of goods, commerce. So ships were going back and forth. And literally, we now have hundreds of various shipwrecks. Those we have not even discovered yet. Under our waters. The Cornfield Point lightship was built around the turn of the 20th century. It was a ship that would go out from its port in Old Saybrook, go out to the middle of the Sound or wherever during storms and serve as a beacon to help guide ships through that area. It is the first light ship that was ever electrified, and it was electrified by Thomas Edison's company. So it's a very prominent and very important vessel. Well, I think it was in 1909, it was out there doing its job. It's a Coast Guard vessel, doing its job, help assisting navigation during a storm, and it collided with a barge, and it sank. And it sank in very deep waters. It's down at 190 feet, which is a very dangerous dive in Long Island Sound. And so for many, many, many years, wreck divers and others have been looking for this vessel unsuccessfully. We got involved with them, working together jointly and with the Long Island Sound program to scan the area of where we thought, based on historic documents, the shipwreck occurred. And we did side scan sonars. And we swept the Long Island Sound going back and forth in that area of the mouth of the Connecticut River. And we got a hit. And it was a very distinct image. The vessel is actually sitting at the bottom of Long Island Sound on its hull. So its masts are still upright. We sent divers down. Again, it's a very dangerous dive at that depth, but they went down, photographed, and were able to find the ship's bell. The ship's bell was photographed, and so we had absolute, and of course the hull with the name Cornfield Point Lightship on it made a positive identification. That site today is a state archaeological preserve recognized for its historic significance in the state of Connecticut. And we leave it as not only a testament to that early history, but also Coast Guard crew members went down with that vessel, and there could still be skeletal remains associated with them under Long Island Sound. So we want to make that clear that some of these shipwrecks are not just wooden and metal artifacts, but they are in fact and can be in fact burials and needed to be treated with respect.
That's an important point, Nick. When we think about how a local diver first came upon this discovery and how, so many people worked together with the technologies you mentioned to find the cornfield. But I'm wondering when we think about, how people should, if they encounter something in the water, and, who has the rights to what is found. Can you talk about that?
Sure. We, in my tenure, we worked very closely with wreck diving groups around the state of Connecticut. It's really important that we entered into a partnership of preservation. We want them to be able to enjoy their activity as divers, but what we want them to do is leave artifacts, leave remnants of the vessels alone so they could be preserved for the future when we would have better technology to get more information from these ships using underwater techniques, but also so that there will be, shipwrecks available to their children and grandchildren. If they strip these vessels, not only are they really destroying a cultural resource, but they're taking away an activity that their children might enjoy. So enjoy the dive, but leave everything alone. And we feel that is extremely important. If a diver or anyone else should believe that they have found a vessel or something underwater that might be of cultural significance, I would encourage them to contact the Office of State Archaeology at the University of Connecticut. Sarah Sportman is the current state archaeologist, and we keep a database up at UConn with her office of all known shipwrecks and other cultural resources in Connecticut's waters. So it would not only add to our databases for preservation purposes, but it would be really important to work together to see that those resources are documented, we understand the history of it, and certainly preserve it for the future.
Nick, is that database accessible to the public if they wanted to learn more?
Not really. We're always worried about vandalism, and we will work with divers that are working with us, if you want to say it that way, to be sure that they too, we want them to dive on these vessels because you know what? They're the ones that have the eyes to see and the ability to get down there, and they can help us preserve these. So we want to work in partnerships with them, but we don't normally release the information to just anybody. We need to know more about, the group or the activity taking place.
Understood. You're hearing with us Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, Emeritus State Archeologist, as we learn more about maritime archaeology, the remains of ships off our coast as well as in our lakes and the Connecticut River. If you have a question for Nick, you can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You know, you mentioned some of the Coast Guard members that died when the Cornfield Point vessel was rammed by a barge. Again in the 1900s. When we think about Connecticut's ship industry and its history, how common were these shipwrecks, Nick?
Oh, it was the waters get pretty nasty, and they literally, it's once said. One underwater archaeologist referred to, you could walk from Stonington, Connecticut to Narragansett Bay, and I guess dive, you wouldn't be able to walk underwater, right? But you would literally go from one shipwreck to another all the way across. So, when you look at Long Island, around Orient Point, Block Island, especially the south shore of Block Island, just, shipwreck after shipwreck. So you're talking 400, maybe even 500 years of shipping historically, and there are a number of wrecks, some of which we do not even know about, and others that have at least been documented. One that we learned about with a wreck diver had to deal with a schooner in the 1860s during the Civil War. Actually, the schooner left Portland, Connecticut, on the Connecticut River. From the Brownstone Quarry, where we have those recreational adventure enterprises today. When that was being quarried, some of that brownstone was actually going to Manhattan to be used in brownstone buildings and so forth in the mid-19th century development of Manhattan. And one particular vessel left Portland heading for Manhattan and never arrived. We do know from the records there was a major storm on the waters, but nobody ever knew what happened to that vessel until a wreck diver working off the coast of Westport came across something and reported it to us, and we went down there. They dove on it across the perpendicular laying across the vessel, the mid and the bow section, were these large slabs of brownstone that had been quarried and were being prepared to go into Manhattan and then recut to fit for the brownstones that they were building. Nobody knew what happened to that vessel, and now we do. It's really an extraordinary little site.
You're listening to Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, my guest, Emeritus State Archaeologist Dr. Nick Bellantoni, who's taking us on a journey to learn about maritime archaeology, including some shipwrecks off of Connecticut's coast and in other places. More with him right after a short break. And if you have a question, you can join us as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, Connecticut families and educators are preparing for the back-to-school season. On the next Where We Live, we sit down with State Department of Education Commissioner Charlene Russell Tucker for the hour. What questions do you have for her? You can join us too. That conversation tomorrow. Today, my guest is Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, Connecticut Emeritus Archeologist, as we talk about notable maritime sites off our coast including shipwrecks. What questions do you have? You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You mentioned earlier, Nick, it's important to work with a variety of people when some of these maritime sites are found. You mentioned this database and also mapping, but I'm imagining this is also expensive work. And so can you get more into that with us?
Oh, sure, and it really is. What we have done is, work with Avery Point, UConn's Avery Point campus, that has been involved in remapping the coastline of Connecticut along Long Island Sound. And that mapping project we tap into because of the fact that, sometimes you get a little subtle, mounding, if you will, along the coast. And those mounds could be either natural deposits or they could be because there's something buried underneath it. Connecticut waters have a lot of, especially Long Island Sound, have a lot of silt. And the silts that drain down the Connecticut, the Thames, the Housatonic rivers, and they build up a lot of silt. And as a result, in many cases, shipwrecks, if you will, get literally buried and become much more difficult for us to find. The other issue, too, is that because of all that silt and because Long Island blocks us from the main ocean, Connecticut's coastal waters, if you will, are very murky and very difficult to see in. So if, some of my divers tell us that, in some cases they can't see beyond the length of their arm. So to be able to identify these is very difficult. And as you can imagine, time consuming. But working with Avery Point, working also with NOAA, years ago was involved with remapping the bottom of Long Island Sound to see where areas needed to be dredged to maintain navigation. And sometimes in that work, they would use side scan sonars and so forth. They may hit an anomaly and send a diver down. And if they identified it as a shipwreck or some other kind of cultural resource, then they would report it to our offices, the Office of State Archaeology and the State Historic Preservation Office. So that's how working together, and also working with wreck divers. We have had many wreck divers report shipwrecks to us in the past. I remember one in the Connecticut River just north of Goodspeed Lighthouse. The Goodspeed Theater, and that area of where the bridge is, the swing bridges. Just north of that, they had been diving and they found a vessel with, it was probably a early 20th century wreck that went down. There was a lot of metal and so forth that we were able to record. We took photographs of it, videos of it, and now have that in our database also. So working with a lot of different agencies, some governments, some private, local folks, trying to put together the best database we can on a very difficult type of resource to identify, and certainly, as you mentioned, very expensive.
Have you ever worked with Robert Ballard? I know our listeners are probably aware that he lives in Connecticut. He's been on our show as well. Oh,
yes. Well, we haven't personally worked with Bob. But one of my colleagues, Kevin McBride, who's a professor at the University of Connecticut in archaeology, Bob and Kevin worked on working with their submersibles to go down along the coast to see if they could find any evidence of Native American sites. Now, we think of sea level rise right now because of climate change and the melting of our glaciers. Well, 20,000 years ago, the glacier started to melt here, releasing the ice from Connecticut around 15,000 years ago. But all that melting eventually raised dramatically the sea level right up to about 4,000 years ago. So as a result, there are many Native American sites that are now submerged. These could be, camps, villages, and so forth. that are no longer above water. So I know Bob and Kevin did a major project, seeing if they could locate such sites under the water.
I know we've been focused on maritime archaeology today, Nick, but as Emeritus state archaeologist, I wanted to hear from you about your perspective to save notable sites in our state. You told the New York Times in 1988 that about 65% of all archaeological sites are in immediate danger of destruction. The estimate then was we lose something like 120 sites or more a year. And you said the majority of that, 70%, is due to economic development, another 20% to vandalism, and 10% to erosion and other natural causes. What does it look like today?
Well, it's hopefully it's improved. Back then, there were very few regulations for the consideration of historical and archaeological sites in economic development projects. There was more vandalism going on, I suspect at that time also for collections. So I like to think those numbers have improved. But, archaeological sites in Connecticut are, they're like an endangered species. When you lose one, you can't get it back again. If a bulldozer cuts through and destroys a Native American site that's 4,000 or 5,000 years old, we can't reconstruct that anymore. We have one chance at it. And that's why, we don't always like to excavate. What we like to do is preserve in place because, again, I think of my students and future generations of archaeologists, be they underwater or on the ground, are going to have far better technology, far better methods of extracting more information from these sites than we're capable of even getting today. And so we need to preserve those sites for that, and also for the heritages of everyone that's been occupied this state. So, what we work very hard to, and Sarah Sportman does today, is to work with municipalities, especially in their land use decision-making capabilities. If we're going to review a subdivision, a shopping mall, a golf course, make sure that archaeological sites and historic sites are considered in the review process, much like the natural resources and wetlands, so that not to be, inhibit development, but to work with development to see that cultural resources are preserved for the future. It's critical, and it's a finite resource. There aren't many sites left, and those that are there need to be preserved.
You're hearing Emeritus State Archaeologist Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni here where we live. If you have a question for him, we can fit you in before we run out of time. Again, our number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Chris shared this on Facebook, wanted to know if you've done any research on the Mystic River near the site of the Battle of Mystic. Chris works at the Mystic Seaport Museum and writes, "We're always looking for ways to highlight the narratives of our indigenous partners."
Well, that was an important battle, the Battle of Stonington and Mystic and that whole area. We have never worked on a shipwreck that I'm aware of in that area, though there are many that we could predict are in the area. The Battle of Stonington and Stonington Borough, my favorite archaeological story is not necessarily an underwater one, but it turns out when the British, during the War of 1812, attacked Stonington, Connecticut, they bombarded for 2 or 3 days the village with armament. Well, a woman, who, I believe her name was Hedda, she was unfortunately had a heart attack in her bed and died during the bombardment. And what the locals did was buried her very quickly in a crater that had occurred in a local cemetery from the British bombardment. And supposedly, lore is that they buried her in the bed and everything. They just put it in the ground and covered it over very hastily. Well, we did some ground penetrating radar with our colleagues at the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we went out and doing the ground penetrating radar in the cemetery, we actually were able to find the crater and somewhat document the story of Hedda and her burial in a bomb crater. Kind of maritime in the terms of the the bombardment by the British Navy, but one of my favorite stories.
We're almost out of time for our listeners who want to learn more without diving. Nick, where can they go?
Well, the offices, Connecticut State Museum of Natural History had on their website has information of what people can do to report sites and get information. We had an exhibit many years ago on underwater archaeology in Connecticut and highlighted a number of sites, some of which we spoke about this morning. So go look, Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at the University of Connecticut, and also the Office of Connecticut State Archaeology at UConn.
Mm. And for listeners who want to learn more about this particular subject of maritime sites and archaeology, as well as more about these shipwrecks, Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni again, who is the State Emeritus Archeologist, giving a talk at the Mattituck Museum. That information on our website. What did you want to leave us with, Nick?
Oh, yeah, just saying, if come on out to the Mattituck, I would just it's nice to do an in-person presentation. So we're looking forward to interacting with folks that are interested. And just to say thank you, Lucy. It's great to be with you again.
Mm. Always a pleasure to have you on. Fascinating stuff, and it's been great to learn from you today. Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, again, who's the Emeritus State Archeologist. His talk at the Mattituck at ctpublic.org/wherewelive for more information. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Our tech director is Kat Pastor. Again, tomorrow we're going to have the State Education Commissioner, Charlene Russell Tucker, on the hour to answer all of your questions as well. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.